C'est bon? Ouais, ok, mieux. Donc, Alfred Hitchcock, quand il a reçu un Oscar pour son œuvre de vie, il a prononcé un discours et puis il a dit cette fameuse phrase, s'il voulait donner un conseil aux jeunes, c'est Stay out of jail. Et puis il racontait l'histoire de petit Alfred quand il avait 5 ou 6 ans. Il avait fait quelque chose de mauvais et puis son père lui a voulu le punir et lui a donné une petite fiche et dit Alfred, tu vas maintenant chez mon copain qui est le policier et tu vas lui donner cette petite fiche. Et puis petit Alfred il fait ça, il donne la petite fiche au policier, le policier le prend à l'oreille et l'amène dans une cellule et le laisse 5 minutes porte fermée dans une cellule seule. Et puis il trouvait que c'était une expérience terrible. Et puis bon, c'était un copain au père, et puis voilà, donc c'était... En tout cas, il dit que c'est un endroit mauvais, où on fait des mauvaises fréquentations, et puis c'est un endroit qui, en tout cas, ne sert pas à la santé. Et je pense c'est quand même assez intéressant de garder ça en mémoire, surtout actuellement où nous vivons une période où on investit massivement dans les prisons. Vous avez peut-être su que le Conseil d'État en 2012 a décidé d'investir 415 millions de francs jusqu'à 2020 ou 2022 dans la construction de prisons où ils vont doubler la capacité. Et puis des coupes ont été faites notamment dans le système éducatif, dans le système social et la santé. Donc une société qui investit massivement dans les prisons, j'aime juste vous montrer ce que ça fait, parce qu'on a des exemples de ça. Donc très brièvement, je vais vous parler des certitudes et croyances autour de l'incarcération, vous montrer quelques aspects sur l'évolution historique, et puis prison et santé, ce lien, et puis pour conclure. Ceux qui ne le savent pas le voient ici, le taux d'incarcération international, en comparaison internationale, est extrêmement varié. Et puis Bree, qui nous fait l'honneur de venir tout à l'ouest des États-Unis, vit en plus en Californie où il y a une surpopulation extrême. Et c'est le taux le plus élevé à 743 personnes pour 100 000 habitants. En Suisse, on a 10 fois moins, on est autour de 78. Et puis le deuxième pays, c'est la Russie. Et puis après l'Afrique du Sud, ça c'est un peu les 3 pays qui tiennent la palme triste de ça. Et quand on regarde ça, effectivement, on a ces comparaisons qu'on peut imaginer tiennent à quoi. En tout cas, on pourrait imaginer, est-ce qu'il y a peut-être plus d'insécurité dans ces pays, aux États-Unis par exemple? Est-ce qu'on est beaucoup plus à risque de décéder? Et on pourrait le penser parce que j'étais récemment à Baltimore. Et là, dans le week-end où j'ai passé, pendant ce week-end, il y a 15 personnes qui ont été assassinées par balle. Donc si par exemple vous travaillez dans des services d'urgence, c'est quelque chose, c'est du pain quotidien que des gens arrivent tous les jours et plusieurs fois par jour avec des blessés par balle aux urgences qui arrivent extrêmement rarement ici à Genève. En tout cas, on pourrait penser ça. Et puis, il y a des personnes qui ont regardé un peu la crime rate. Hein. C'est pas par 100 000 comme le taux d'incarcération. C'est si on prend tous les crimes qui sont commis, donc des infractions qui mènent à une interpellation de la police par 1000, vous voyez qu'il n'y a aucune relation avec le taux d'incarcération. Et notamment quand vous comparez ce qui se passe dans un pays voisin comme l'Allemagne et la Suisse, vous voyez déjà, en fait, par rapport au taux de criminalité, mais là c'est aussi des infractions contre le code de la route, en tout cas, il y a, on pourrait penser qu'en Suisse, en tout cas, on incarcère par rapport au nombre de crimes 2 fois plus que comparé à l'Allemagne, okay, avec des taux assez bas et assez similaires. Et et ça c'est une question à vous, je pose la question, qu'est-ce que vous pensez, la criminalité dans les 30 dernières années en Suisse, si on prend tous les délits, hein, vous les voyez ici, les délits, graves et moins graves, l'évolution est comment? Ça a augmenté, ça a baissé ou ça resté stable? Vous allez me montrer la main pour ceux qui pensent que ça a augmenté. 1, 2, 3, 4, qui pensent que c'est resté stable, la majorité, et qui pensent que ça a baissé. 3. Ok. C'est normalement, disons souvent, quand je pose cette question, c'est une forte augmentation. Et quand vous regardez les statistiques, je vous invite, quand vous lisez des articles dans la presse par rapport à l'évolution des délits, regardez toujours l'espace quand c'est décrit. Très souvent, vous allez voir dans les journaux, comparé à 2012, les cambriolages ont explosé ou ont baissé maintenant, puisqu'on a un conseil d'État très fort sur ce thème. Donc, tout dépend quelle est l'intention politique derrière. On compare souvent à l'année d'avant, et notamment quand c'est la délinquance des jeunes qui est plutôt rare. Vous pouvez vous imaginer que d'une année à l'autre, il y a des variations très fortes qui peuvent après faire des gros titres. La délinquance des jeunes filles, par exemple, explose de 100% d'une année à l'autre. Donc il faut toujours regarder ça sur une longue période, par exemple sur 30 ans. Et quand on est ici avec 323 000 délits en 82, on voit que, en tout cas jusqu'à 2008, plutôt aucune augmentation, plutôt une baisse avec des petits pics qui sont entre deux. Okay? En tout cas, c'est pas plus dangereux aujourd'hui en Suisse comparé à avant. Et quand on compare ça par 1000 habitants, où ça se passe, c'est effectivement là où sont le plus de gens, c'est-à-dire dans les centres urbains, qui sont aussi des centres qui sont plutôt riches en Suisse. Et la deuxième question, la délinquance des jeunes. Quelle est l'évolution sur 30 ans? Qu'est-ce que vous pensez? Ça a augmenté? Ça a baissé? Encore une fois, qui pense que ça a augmenté les jeunes? 3. Même chose. Et qui s'est baissé? Et la majorité n'a pas d'avis. Je vais vous montrer. Alors là, c'est, en tout cas, on peut dire que depuis 90, c'est extrêmement stable. Okay? Et vous pouvez vous imaginer les gros titres qu'on a entendus les dernières années là-dessus. Il faut faire très attention avec ça. Et je pense là, il y a vraiment beaucoup, c'est aussi souvent des non-scientifiques qui mènent ces chiffres, et puis c'est un peu problématique en tout cas. Alors, je vais venir maintenant sur l'évolution historique. Et par exemple, aux États-Unis, un pays qui avait depuis 1930 jusqu'à 1970 une population emprisonnée assez stable, autour de 200, 250 000, 300 000 personnes aux États-Unis, pays aujourd'hui 300 millions d'habitants. Et puis il y a quelque chose qui se passe en 1970. Je vous dirai tout à l'heure ce qui s'est passé, mais là, ça a explosé. Okay? Et puis il y a deux facteurs qui expliquent ça. Il faut savoir qu'au monde, nous avons 10 millions de détenus. Un quart des détenus est incarcéré dans les prisons américaines, un quart en Russie et en Chine, et puis le reste ailleurs. Le coût aux États-Unis est de l'ordre de 49 milliards de dollars par année. Je vous dis, on construit Curabilis, c'est un centre pour des personnes dangereuses qui ont commis un acte délictueux avec des troubles psychiatriques. Ça coûte 1000 francs par jour, 30 000 francs par mois, 360 000 francs par année pour une personne. Il y a 90 personnes qui sont incarcérées là, et c'est des gens qui vont rester en partie à vie dans ce centre. Donc l'incarcération est extrêmement chère. 49 milliards de dollars aux États-Unis, 70 000 dollars par détenu et par année en moyenne. Le salaire annuel d'un travail des Américains est de 47 000 dollars. Donc, il faut mettre ça un petit peu en proportion. En tout cas, une société qui prend un choix d'incarcérer massivement paye ça extrêmement cher. Et puis, ça n'augmente pas la sécurité. On sait que les gens, par exemple, dans les communautés où on incarcère plus, ça déstabilise tout le réseau social autour, et puis les gens deviennent encore plus précaires, et là, l'insécurité va encore augmenter. Il y a ça. Alors, qu'est-ce qui explique cette augmentation? ces deux phénomènes, on appelle ça transcarcération, et c'est le phénomène le plus important. On a pu voir, c'est de nouveau aux États-Unis, donc vous avez le nombre de détenus dans les prisons qui a augmenté depuis les années 70. Et puis, il y avait, à un moment donné, il y avait aussi un film de Jack Nicholson, disons avec Jack Nicholson, Vol au-dessus d'un nid de coucou, qui montrait un peu les asiles psychiatriques avec des conditions inhumaines, graves, dans ces institutions. Et puis, il y avait un mouvement d'ouvrir massivement des instituts, des asiles psychiatriques, qui contenaient ces personnes-là qui étaient inadaptées pour la société. Et puis, à un moment donné, effectivement, si on ajoute quelque part ces deux courbes, les gens qui sont dans les institutions psychiatriques fermées, et puis dans les prisons, on voit pendant un certain nombre d'années, ou quelques décennies finalement, il y avait une baisse de nombres qui sont dans les institutions. Et puis, c'est des gens qui n'arrivaient pas à rester dehors parce qu'il fallait les mettre. Et puisque les asiles psychiatriques n'étaient plus disponibles pour eux, ces personnes-là sont devenues des prisonniers. Et puis, restaient dans les prisons. Et puis, ça, c'est une explication. La deuxième explication, c'est juste qu'en 1970, vous savez qui était le président américain en 1970? C'est Richard Nixon. Et puis, lui, il a déclaré the war on drugs. C'est la guerre contre la drogue. Et puis, on a mis massivement ces personnes en prison. Et puis, notamment en Californie, ils ont aussi renforcé les lois. C'est aussi quelque chose qui est, par exemple, en Suisse, très souvent demandé, surtout après des horribles crimes qu'on a vécu malheureusement récemment à Genève, où on veut que ces personnes ne peuvent plus jamais sortir de la prison, on veut les institutionnaliser à vie. Et puis en Californie, ils sont allés tellement loin de dire, ils ont fait une loi qui s'appelle le Triple Strike. Quand tu commets un crime qui est l'équivalent à un vol de $500 à 3 reprises, si tu es condamné à 3 reprises, typiquement le toxicomane qui va voler un iPhone, et puis après encore un ordinateur, encore autre chose, il a une peine de prison qui va à vie. C'est prison à vie. Et puis aux États-Unis, prison à vie, c'est prison à vie. C'est pas comme en Allemagne, par exemple, les terroristes qui tuent le président de la Bundesbank, après 15 ans, ils sont dehors pour des raisons humanistes. Parce qu'on veut donner une chance à toute personne. Aux États-Unis, il y a des prisons où il y a des soins palliatifs, où des gens meurent. J'ai visité des prisons où il y a des gens qui meurent chaque semaine dans cette prison, parce qu'ils ne laissent pas sortir des vieillards qui sont là-dedans et qui sont souvent démons. Donc c'est des situations vraiment inhumaines et graves. Quelques remarques par rapport à la Suisse. En Suisse, on a finalement un taux encore assez bas en comparaison internationale. On a environ 6000 détenus. On détient certainement le record d'institutions le plus nombreux par rapport au nombre de détenus. Les 6000 détenus, ils tiendraient en Californie en 3 prisons très facilement. En Suisse, il y a 114 prisons. Maintenant, cette année, il y avait 109 prisons. Il faut savoir que c'est un problème masculin. La criminalité qui mène à la prison, c'est des hommes, à 96% en comparaison aussi européenne. On trouve toujours les mêmes chiffres. Le taux d'étrangers est très élevé en Suisse et puis il va certainement augmenter. Peut-être juste un exemple encore. Imaginez-vous, vous êtes, disons, il y a peut-être un Suisse qui est prof d'école qui va arroser, une soirée bien arrosée, il va rentrer en voiture et sur le quai de Colonie ou de Vesna, il est arrêté par la police à 4 h du matin. Et puis il demande de baisser la fenêtre, il va sentir l'alcool et puis le policier va dire mais vous sortez maintenant de la voiture s'il vous plaît. Et puis le type va râler, va pouvoir faire ça. Les policiers vont le sortir de la voiture, il va peut-être encore pousser le policier. Donc c'est résistance contre les forces de l'ordre et puis ils vont l'amener au poste de police. Et puis ils vont probablement ouvrir une enquête, voire une procédure judiciaire, très, très certainement. Et qu'est-ce qui va arriver à cette personne? Il va rentrer chez lui, il va attendre son procès, il va être puni par un juge, peine pécuniaire probablement, et puis l'affaire est réglée. Si la même chose arrive à quelqu'un qui est étranger, sans papier de surcroît par exemple. Exactement la même histoire, 4 heures du matin, alcool, résistance contre la force de l'ordre. La personne va être immédiatement mise à Chandelon parce qu'il pourrait y avoir un délit de fuite. On met des gens en prison parce qu'ils pourraient fuir, donc échapper à la peine, ou ils pourraient refaire la même chose, donc dangerosité, un meurtre, on va incarcérer, ou risque de collusion, donc le col blanc qui a commis un acte et qui veut après dissimuler les ordinateurs. Ça, c'est les 3 raisons pourquoi on met quelqu'un en prison en général. Et les étrangers, on met tous en prison. Et c'est pour ça, de plus en plus, surtout en prison préventive, on a actuellement à Chandelon 90% d'étrangers. Mais le taux moyen en Suisse, c'est 70%. Donc il y a une forte injustice. Et les conséquences d'être emprisonné et attendre le procès en prison, vous pouvez vous imaginer, l'étranger, il va perdre son boulot, il va peut-être perdre sa famille, les enfants, ils vont être stigmatisés à l'école parce que les autres vont dire mais ton papa est en prison. Il va probablement avoir plus d'argent pour se payer un bon avocat, donc ce sera un stagiaire avocat qui va le défendre, et puis le prof, il va se payer un bon avocat. Là aussi, il y aura des sentences probablement très différentes. Donc c'est très très complexe, et la justice n'est jamais juste. Il y a un très fort gradient socio-économique là-dedans, en fonction des moyens qu'on a. Et pour finir, j'aimerais juste vous montrer à Genève, il n'y a pas seulement une prison, il n'y a pas seulement Chandelon, il y a toutes ces prisons à travers le canton. Et en plus, il y aura Curabilis, il y aura Brenna 2. Donc, il y a vraiment tout un parc de prisons qui existe sur le canton de Genève, avec 2 structures hospitalières aussi pour des soins somatiques à l'hôpital cantonal, et puis à Belle-Idée, l'unité pour soins psychiatriques. Et ça, c'est Chandelon, photo récente, donc qui est proche de Pupplinge, Choulet, qui aujourd'hui a battu un nouveau record de surpopulation. C'est une prison construite pour 376 personnes et qui aujourd'hui a 856 personnes à bord. Vous imaginez des gens avec des matelas par terre dans des conditions extrêmement difficiles. Et puis là derrière, il y a Curabilis qui va être construit pour des fous dangereux quelque part. Ok, et la surpopulation à Chandelon effectivement a fortement augmenté. Donc 2008, on était encore en dessous de 500 et aujourd'hui, elle a 856 personnes dans cette prison. Très très forte augmentation depuis une décision, notamment de la justice et du magistrat, de ne plus d'avoir une tolérance zéro et puis de mettre les gens massivement en prison. Problème de santé, mais je crois que là je vais parler une autre fois. Il y aura une autre conférence le 14 novembre parce que j'aimerais plus laisser la place à Brie aujourd'hui. Et pour finir peut-être là-dessus, il y a des organes, notamment à Genève, on a le Conseil d'État qui a un extrait de PV qui est une base légale pour notre travail. Il y a le Conseil de l'Europe qui a fait beaucoup de textes. Il y a Stephen Hengist qui travaille à l'OMS, qui a aussi rédigé des textes importants. Et puis il y a aussi d'autres structures comme l'Académie suisse des sciences médicales qui rédigent des textes. Et puis la base de ça, c'est ces 7 principes. Donc il faut avoir toujours un accès aux médecins en prison. Il faut pratiquer l'équivalence de soins, donc la même médecine qu'à l'extérieur, certainement sur la base LAMAL, donc on ne va pas les comparer à la médecine privée. Le consentement du patient, la confidentialité, très important. Prévention sanitaire, donc tout ce qui est prévention, intervention humanitaire, ça veut dire de tiendre compte des besoins spécifiques des groupes vulnérables, particulièrement vulnérables, des personnes handicapées, des femmes qui sont une minorité en prison, des personnes, par exemple, des transsexuels, des homosexuels aussi, qui sont vite des victimes. L'indépendance professionnelle, c'est un immense sujet. Il faut dire que la Suisse ne brille pas avec ça. Genève était le premier canton au monde, la première république au monde, on peut dire, qui avait l'indépendance en 1963, donc il y a 50 ans. Le premier pays au monde, c'était la Norvège, 25 ans plus tard, en 1987. Et depuis, la France, l'Angleterre, l'Écosse, l'Italie, le Kosovo bientôt, tous les pays qui se réforment vont vers une indépendance, c'est-à-dire l'indépendance totale des services de santé, des structures pénitentiaires et judiciaires. Et puis la Suisse, seulement 3 des 26 cantons ont ça, Genève, Vaud et le Valais. Et tous les autres cantons ont des systèmes mixtes, où le pire, à Zurich, où le médecin est dans l'hierarchie pénitentiaire, soumis au directeur. Vous pouvez vous imaginer un directeur qui va dire « Mais j'aimerais avoir le statut HIV de Monsieur X ». Et c'est au médecin après de dire soit je risque mon poste et je ne donne pas ces informations, ou je protège vraiment le secret médical pour dire au directeur c'est une information que je ne peux pas te donner. Mais je risque mon poste à ce moment-là. Ou je ne le fais pas, je préfère donner cette info et puis je transgresse ma loyauté envers le patient. Et enfin, la compétence professionnelle aussi, je pense que c'est important d'avoir des formations continues, les mêmes exigences FMH en prison comme à l'extérieur. Ok? Ça, c'est très important. Et puis, donc finalement, ces principes, ils sont très très clairement formulés pour la médecine pénitentiaire, mais finalement, c'est la base de toute médecine. Je pense que quand vous pratiquez aux urgences, à l'étage, en pratique privée, c'est toujours le même principe que vous allez appliquer aussi. Pour conclure, donc, attention aux statistiques et à ce qu'on vous dit par rapport à l'insécurité. L'accès aux soins est très important pour l'ensemble des détenus. Parfois, c'est le premier contact, c'est une population vulnérable. Et puis, on a aussi une opportunité prison dont je ne vais pas tellement parler, mais c'est que good prison health is good public health. Et puis, la pratique de la médecine vulnérable avec les populations vulnérables permet d'identifier les faiblesses des systèmes de sécurité sociale et renforcer la justice sociale. Ça, je vais développer aussi une autre fois. Mais, par exemple, on a eu des situations où la justice a essayé de traiter les détenus différents que des autres patients. Et je pense là, il ne faut jamais permettre ça, parce que si on permet ça, de traiter des populations vulnérables différemment, notamment par rapport à la confidentialité, par rapport à d'autres aspects, à certaines pratiques de force, par exemple, à ce moment-là, c'est comme une brèche dans certains principes fondamentaux de la médecine et de la pratique de la médecine, et qui peuvent aller après sur d'autres populations vulnérables comme les obèses, comme les vieux, comme les personnes avec handicap. Et puis il y a beaucoup de personnes, il y a Nelson Mandela, il y a Gandhi, mais ici Dostoïevski aussi, qui disait finalement on connaît la nature d'une civilisation qu'en visitant ces prisons. Et personnellement, j'ai eu la chance de visiter 6 prisons américaines. Et je peux vous dire que j'étais passablement sous le choc de voir ce qui se passe là, les conditions de détention qui étaient juste horribles. Et que, donc c'est un plaisir, je peux le dire très ouvertement avec Brie, en tout cas de l'accueillir et peut-être lui passer la parole maintenant pour qu'elle vous parle de vieillissement qui est vraiment aussi une conséquence d'une politique d'incarcération, d'une politique judiciaire, et c'est jamais anodin. Et je pense que, par exemple, en Suisse, il y a des pressions extrêmement fortes de renforcer tout le cadre légal, les lois, pour remplir ces prisons. Et je pense Brie va nous montrer ça maintenant.
Hello, everybody. I'm Brie Williams, and it is an absolute pleasure to be here. Dr. Wolf, I'm not sure how many of you have had the pleasure of meeting him and working with him, but he's really incredibly well known throughout the world, and certainly in the United States, where I've been really lucky to be colleagues with him, and he's really contributed an enormous amount to the literature on the criminal justice system and its interaction with health. I really encourage you all to seek him out as a mentor and a colleague. He's simply fantastic. Anyway, I am going to talk a little bit about aging in the prison system, especially in the United States, although this has really become a worldwide phenomenon. If I'm speaking too quickly, just raise your hand. I wish I could give it in French, but oh well. This is a disclosure slide that's required in universities in the United States. It basically says whether or not you have a conflict of interest. So I have to put it here, but essentially I have been a consultant to different prison systems and in legal cases around confinement. I don't feel that these relationships had an influence. If you need to ask me about it later, you're welcome to. So first of all, why did I get involved in this area? You know, I wasn't born sort of thinking, oh, I'm going to go to medical school, and then one day, if I'm lucky, I'm going to study older adults in the criminal justice system. But as I started getting involved with healthcare for older adults who are vulnerable and impoverished, I started learning more and more about different cases, and it really piqued my interest as a geriatrician, which is what I am, and also as a hospice and palliative care physician, which I also am. So take, for example, a 63-year-old woman who had been in prison. She was put on the top bunk. She fell off the top bunk, and she broke her hip. She went to the hospital. She got it fixed. Top bunk, sorry. So bunk beds. That's what a top bunk is. And so she fell off. She got her hip fixed at the hospital. She came back, and they put her back on the top bunk. And guess what happened? She fell off, and she broke her other hip. Or a 71-year-old man who had dementia, so very bad memory impairment. He was released after 15 years of being incarcerated, and he was told to go to San Francisco, where he had been arrested. That's where he was supposed to go to meet with his officer after he got released, but he didn't remember, and so he got off the bus in Sacramento, a different city. He went to the police station the next day, and he said, "Where's my parole officer?" And they sent him back for a mandatory one-year sentence for missing his appointment. Or a 75-year-old woman who had been acting strange in the county jail, and she basically was arrested for horrible elder neglect of her older husband who is demented. I mean, it was horrible. And 6 months into her trial, they discovered that she had a frontal lobe brain tumor, which basically accounted for her new neglectful behavior. So I'm going to talk a little bit about aging trends in the criminal justice system and really worldwide. I'm going to very briefly describe the health of older prisoners. These are obviously extreme cases, but they're all too common. I'm going to tell you a little bit, though, about the criminal justice aging crisis, and that's really what I'm going to focus on today. I'm going to list examples of how models of care from academic geriatrics and palliative medicine, which is what I do, how I feel that they can be applied to this crisis to come to some resolution. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about some next steps if we have time. So first of all, aging trends in the criminal justice system. So we live in what I will call the century of aging. Many of you may have seen this graph. It's at least very popular in the United States. This is from The Lancet in 2009. This shows life expectancy over the last 160-odd years. This is mostly the US and across Western Europe, although this looks the same in all areas except sub-Saharan Africa and parts of Southeast Asia. So you can see there are two big dips. Ideas about what those dips are? Wars. And actually, the reason why World War I has a bigger dip is because of the influenza epidemic, which actually killed more people than the war. And this global aging shift is really going to dominate the social, political, and public health landscape of the 21st century. And this is also happening in the criminal justice system, where professionals are seeing an increase in victims, in arrestees, in witnesses, in probationers, or people who have been released, in parolees, also released, and in prisoners. So who are older prisoners? And just to make my job a little bit more difficult, nobody has a consensus about who exactly are older prisoners. In the UK, most of the literature considers people age 60 and older as older prisoners. In the US, most states consider it 55 or older, some as low as 40, kind of horrifying, and some up to age 70. Regardless of the exact age cutoff, when you're considered an older or geriatric prisoner, almost everybody buys into a concept of accelerated aging. And what that is it basically takes into account the very common risk factors for bad health that many prisoners have experienced throughout their lifetime, things like substance abuse, head trauma, low education, poverty. And basically what this all results in is a physiologic age, or what you look like, is basically 10 to 15 years older than your chronologic age, or what it says on your birth certificate. A little bit? Slower? Lentement. There's some pictures, so those will be good. A picture says 1,000 words, right? So criminal justice populations are aging, and I'm going to give you examples from the United States and a couple examples from other countries as well, but since I'm from the United States and we're so proud to have the most, I'm going to tell you all about them. So arrestees are aging. Those are the people who go and get arrested by the police officers for doing something wrong. So this is from, again, the United States. From 2007 to 2009, there was a 0.4% increase in total arrests in the United States, but a corresponding 19% increase in arrestees of people age 55 or older in 2 years. Jail inmate populations are aging, so this is a Monopoly card, and my father made me put this on the slide. Have you guys ever played the board game Monopoly? Yeah, okay. From 1996 to 2008, there was a 53% overall population increase in U.S. jails. And what jails are there for people who have not been sentenced yet. They've been arrested. They go to jail, and that's a pre-trial before they see or finish with their court. Before they get their sentence, they basically are confined in this jail, and then they'll generally go to prison if they're found guilty. In the jails, so 95% leave before 6 months. The vast majority are gone in 2 weeks. But almost everybody's gone in 6 months. That said, they come back. So we have about 12 million Americans go to jail every year. And again, a very much higher increase in older adults in the jail system. And prison populations are aging. So when I get to this point in the talk, a lot of people say, well, you know what, the U.S. population is aging, and that's why the prison population is aging, and that's true. So this is the U.S. population, age 55 or older, over 20 years. And it increased 50% alone in those 20 years. And then people say, well, maybe it's just that the U.S. prison population has been increasing, and that's also, as you saw, very true. It increased over 100% over 20 years. That said, it's actually starting to dip a little bit down. I think we lost 200,000 prisoners last year. It's very exciting. But that does not account for this. So this is the number of U.S. prisoners age 55 or older in state and federal prisons over 20 years. As you can see, this has increased over 550% over those 20 years and is continuing to rise. The next most common, the next most quickly rising group of prisoners is age 45 to 55. So this is going to just continue to accelerate. And this is really an international issue. I promised that I would show a little bit about slides from other countries. So in the UK, older prisoners increased more than 200% since 1990. They're actually the fastest growing prisoner age group. There's another 128% increase from 2010 to 2011 when this percent was taken. And overall, about 10.5% of prisoners in the UK are now age 50 or older, which is actually higher than what we have in the US. We have about 9.8 to 10. And in Japan, older prisoners have increased about 85% over those since 2000, not since 1990. And this is a 17% increase in Japanese citizens over 60, but an 87% increase, again, in Japanese prisoners over 60. Their prison population is about 12.3% older adult. So what does this mean in the century of aging? Basically, the population in the entire world will double of those 65 and older by 2040. So we can expect much higher numbers. And really, around many countries, we see rising number of older arrestees, longer sentences. Again, Hans talked a little bit about second and third strikes in the U.S. Actually, in California, we just outlawed it. We voted against it in November. It's very exciting. So a lot of people are working hard to get all those people out. But regardless, many states still have it, and California paved the way for them. And many other reasons that people are there for a very long time that Dr. Wolf already spoke about. So I'm going to very briefly talk about the health of older prisoners. And the reason why I'm going to keep it brief is that There are few studies, but also very few surprises. Basically, you see what you would expect in a very low socioeconomic status population of patients. There's a very high burden of disability. People have a hard time getting around, and a lot of chronic disease. And following release from prison, after people get out, they have the lowest rate of coming back to prison when they're old, but they're very vulnerable to social challenges, things like being homeless, having low chances of getting employed when they're old and frail and have a prison record. They go back to unsafe neighborhoods in bad health. There are also preliminary evidence of extraordinarily high rates of dementia in people as young as 55 years. And medical staff are often poorly equipped to recognize and respond to these age-related health issues that are a consequence of incarceration or related to incarceration in the population. Also, relatively little is known about mental health, which is really shocking since you saw the slide about transcarceration, that a lot of people were basically, instead of going to mental institutions, they go to the criminal justice system, and yet there are very little studies to describe what's happening for older adults or even what the special needs may be. So in the UK, more than 50% of older adults in the criminal justice system have psychiatric diagnoses, and by far they're very largely untreated. Example is 14% of people with depression, older adults with depression in the UK criminal justice system are being treated with antidepressants. In the US, states are sort of all over the map. We don't have a national data repository. Serious mental illness, things like schizophrenia, it's about 11 to 16%, but a national survey has estimated that sort of all mental illness is at least 40% in older prisoners. And also for us, just as it is in the UK, it's the most commonly undertreated medical condition. Older adults also have very special psychosocial needs, additional ones that aren't kind of captured in these statistics. Things like being afraid of dying in prison, being afraid of getting victimized or having violence happen to them in prison. Things like being estranged from family or friends. Parents will die, siblings will die on the outside, and they don't get to go to the funeral. And for people who've been in prison for decades, many, many years, they may have a very difficult time when they get out doing things like balancing a checkbook or knowing how to cook for themselves. And US prisons do not actually teach those skills, although in Denmark they do, and perhaps they do here a little bit. And substance use in older prisoners, even less is known, which is really shocking because this is the number 1, 2, 3, and 4 cause of older adults getting arrested and coming to jails and prisons across the nation. So now I'm going to introduce this concept of the criminal justice aging crisis. And I don't want to use the word crisis loosely. I mean, I don't want to be sort of inflammatory if I don't need to be. And so I went to the dictionary and I looked up what the word means. And let me tell you what the word means. And you can tell me whether you agree that the United States, at least, and probably worldwide, we are entering a crisis. So crisis is a crucial or decisive point or situation. It's an unstable condition. And it's a point in a story or a drama where a conflict reaches its highest tension and has to be resolved. So what's the drama? The drama is that common age-related conditions can pose very special challenges for older prisoners. So for example, over 50% of people age 60 or older have hearing impairment. They can't hear well. In prison, this is a special problem. If you can't hear older prisoners behind you asking you to get out of the way, you can get into a fight or you can be victimized. If you don't hear orders from staff telling you to get out of the way, get down on the ground, get over there, you might actually get written up because you broke a rule, and then your sentence gets longer if you have enough of them. Urinary incontinence, extraordinarily common in men, especially over the age of 65 or 70. This becomes an extraordinary safety risk when you are in a cell with 2 or 3 or 4 other people and you're not allowed out for 48 hours, for 72 hours, and suddenly your bed things start to smell a little bit. People can get very angry and frustrated in those situations. What's the tension? The tension is that most systems are totally unprepared to address the unique problems of this population. This was the front page of the New York Times from last year. The article was called "The Vanishing Mind, Life with Dementia." And it says dementia is a fast-growing phenomenon in prisons that many are not prepared to handle. And this will just continue to get more and more common. 50% of people over the age of 80 have dementia and even more are cognitively impaired. And this is a completely unstable condition. Those are bunk beds. Picture's worth 1,000 words, right? So this is a total mismatch between function, or what a person is able to do physically, and the environment or the place that they find themselves living in. So these are triple bunk livings in California. You have these in the Swiss prisons as well. Double. We actually are starting to phase these out in California. This is wonderful news because of a court order that said we were dangerously overcrowded, but many states still have triple bunks. And you can imagine, I mean, honestly, I don't think I could get on the top bunk. The middle bunk wouldn't be so easy either for a 70-year-old. The bottom bunk actually could be the hardest because it's hard to get that low on the ground. So this is a total mismatch between what people can do and the environment they find themselves in. And I think that we've really reached the crucial point in the story because older prisoners, if you don't care for any other reason, they're at the root of a correctional cost crisis in many, many countries. Annual correctional spending in the US, I have $77 billion, and that's not just health. But that's from 2012. This rivals, and for example, in my state, California, we spend more on corrections than we do on higher education. The current healthcare costs are only about 10%, although it depends on sort of what you call 10%. So they're in the order of $8 billion across the nation. It's a lot of money. And the national per capita prison healthcare spending tripled in the last decade. The problem is that only 37% of our states actually publicly report this data, so we don't even know it could be worse than that. And data from 5 large state prison systems showed that older prisoners are costing at least 3 to 9 times the cost of younger prisoners to incarcerate. So remember, that was 77,000, I think, was the statistic you found, and it's about 9 times the cost in some states, so we're talking about a lot of money. Just that, you know, the UN has also started to recognize this as an international phenomenon and has identified old age as a special needs group in their recommendations from the Office on Drug and Crimes in the Handbook for Prisoners with Special Needs. They basically say courts should review sentencing policies. They talk about having geriatric training for staff. They talk about helping older adults obtain legal counsel, to do initial and ongoing assessments to figure out what older adults need, to think about where they're living, to create targeted health care for them, and to find a place that's close to home for visits because their older relatives might have a hard time getting to visit them. So how many of you would say that we've reached a crisis situation? Do you guys agree with me, or do you think I'm being a little bit too flip using that word? Agree. Most of you totally disagree. Maybe you don't know. Okay. Well, that's good. At least most of you agree with me. I like that. That's good. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what my team does, how we're trying to address this problem, and work through some policies using basically academic models of geriatric care, or the care of old people, and palliative care, or the care of people with serious illness and who are dying, to basically try to address this crisis. So you do not need to memorize this slide or even be able to read the whole thing. But this is the general model of academic geriatric care. It basically says that patient health and function, so the ability of somebody to get around and their basic health, interacts with their environment, what we talked about with the bunk beds. That interacts with psychosocial factors, things like their educational attainment, if there's substance use, if they have mental health problems. All these things affect outcomes, both in prison, things like hospitalization, acute care use, mortality, and also after they are released. And we're basically trying to take this very, very basic academic model, apply it to this crisis. I'm going to give you 2 or 3 examples, depending on time, of some of the work we've done, and then go into some of the next steps that this has brought us to. You guys understanding me so far, basically, enough? So first, functional and environmental mismatch. The first thing that I saw when I walked into those prisons was those triple bunks, and I just thought, oh my God, this just makes no sense. I mean, my grandmother could come in here with no medical degree and tell them exactly what they need to do. So I should be able to do something within a medical degree. So functional impairment is basically in the general population, we think of activities of daily living. And how many of you are familiar with this concept? This is the way that you assess function, especially in older adults. Things like, are they able to be independent with bathing, with dressing, with using the toilet, moving from one place to another, and feeding themselves? If you can't do these things, at least in the United States, if you don't have a 24-hour helper, you need to be in a nursing home, because these are the things that are necessary to be independent in living. We also look at things that are called instrumental activities of daily living. Those are sort of the in-between stuff, the stuff where you need some help, but you don't absolutely have to do them to survive. Things like shopping and cooking and cleaning and laundry, etc. So these things in geriatrics are extraordinarily important. First of all, there are red flags. So if you lose your ability to do one of these things, it basically tells you that there's a horrible medical or psychosocial, less commonly, problem looming in the backdrop. They're extraordinarily important for life expectancy. Actually, your ability to complete these tasks is more important in terms of your life expectancy and your prognosis than congestive heart failure, or even than a diagnosis of cancer in old people. And resource planning. So basically, if you look at an entire population, if you can say how many problems they have in functional impairments, then you basically know what you're going to need for that population in terms of long-term care needs, hospitalizations, mortality, and cost. So we thought, well, how does this look in prison? And so when I say prison, I also mean jails and all sorts of detainment facilities. I just want to say that because sometimes people wonder. These are frequently designed for younger, healthy inmates. I mean, nobody thought when we were going crazy building prisons in the United States in the 80s that we were going to have this epidemic of aging in the criminal justice system. So we really did not create prisons intended for those people. And these places often require a much higher level of physical ability, things like being able to get down on the floor very quickly when you hear an alarm. And activities of daily living, that scale that looks at those basic abilities, that's very useful in prison, just like it is in the community. I mean, if you can't feed yourself, you need help. If you can't get dressed, use the toilet, you need help. But instrumental activities of daily living, which are also really important, they're just pretty irrelevant, at least in our prison system, where people don't have to do their own laundry, they don't have to use the phone, they don't shop, they don't use transportation, etc. And so we thought, well, maybe there are some extra activities that could tell prison officials that a person is sort of starting to get to that place where they need help, but they haven't actually developed all those big ADL impairments yet. So we did a study with 120 older women prisoners across the state of California, and we identified through small focus groups and also through surveys 5 activities that affected independence for those women in those prisons. Those were the ability to drop to the floor for an alarm, or even worse was getting back up again after the alarm was over. Being able to stand for head count, basically to be counted by the guards. Sometimes people would have to stand out in the sun for an hour and a half to be counted. Getting to the dining hall on time for meals so that they didn't miss the meal by the time they got there. Being able to hear the orders from the staff, and being able to climb on and off of their assigned bunk, whether it was on the top, middle, or bottom. And we found that these really worked like instrumental activities of daily living, that people had them before they had activity of daily living impairment. And we found that things that these were associated, even just in a very brief questionnaire, with bad stuff. And we made recommendations to the policy folks in California around these. We recommended that when assessing a patient's function, that officials really need to consider the unique required tasks of the environment they were living in, and that recognizing that these tasks may differ from prison to prison. They might be different in the Utah prisons than they are in the California prisons, or by security level. We recommended making a list of activities for every different type of housing facility, and then to use these activities when you consider housing. These are really basic concepts, but this was the first time that this had been done in California. And as a way to risk stratify people, so we recommended if people had problems with these prison activities, that you should see them more often in the prison healthcare system. So a second example, informal caregivers. And now we're down at the bottom of this graphic. Basically thinking about psychosocial factors that contribute to outcomes in older adults, and this is caregiver support. And caregiver support is basically a core component of geriatric care. informal caregivers, so people who are not paid. Basically, in the community, these are family and friends, and they are the backbone of geriatric care. More important than anything else in an older person's life is whether or not they have caregiver support when they're very sick and disabled. In prison, we started to recognize this bizarre phenomenon that actually correctional officers or guards actually were acting sort of like caregivers. And I don't want to use that word caregiver like they're not providing care necessarily, but they're the people who, just like a brother would say, call the doctor and say, you know what, this person looks confused, or this person's falling a lot, I think you need to see them, even when the person was not going to ask for medical care on their own. So we did interviews with 71 guards, about 618 randomly selected older prisoners across the state of California. We found that 34% of these prisoners aged 55 or older were totally unknown to their assigned guard. And we found that about a quarter of prisoners older than 70 were totally unknown to their assigned guard. And so let me give you a couple examples. This is an example where the Department of Corrections, so the prison, had identified somebody as very high risk, and the officer had no idea who he was. He was a 70-year-old man who the Department of Corrections said he couldn't walk well, and so he had an impairment. The medical records that we looked at showed that he also had dementia, and he couldn't hear. The officer had no idea who he was. But then we identified people who the officers said were extremely high risk, and the Department of Corrections did not have them on the high-risk list. So a 76-year-old man who was identified as high risk by his officer, he said he has memory impairment, he can't get from his bed to the toilet, and from his toilet to standing position. The guard had to help him. He said he forgets his medicines, he loses his way to his cell, to his room. He doesn't remember the staff names or their faces. He even forgets he's in prison. He gets into fights because he goes into someone else's bed and he says it's his. And he's totally unsafe and needs more care. And actually, this correctional officer started crying during our interview because he was so stressed out about this caregiving responsibility. So we again made recommendations based on this geriatric care model. We said that overcrowding can impede familiarity, knowledge of the prisoners, and that really a low guard-to-prison ratio is really necessary for older adults. Again, this is not rocket science, but we had to have a study to show that this policy was important. And we advocating developing a direct means of communication for officers to communicate disability to the administration. You know, a lot of times the officers are insecure talking to the physicians and feel like, well, maybe I don't know, maybe this is wrong, maybe I shouldn't be reporting this. And so we're recommending, if you see it, report it to a physician because they need to know. And especially training officers to think about the stuff that's really important for older adults. Things like geriatric disability and falls and confusion, stuff like that. I'm going to talk about one more example, and this is about dying and prognosis and what's happening in the United States around this and really around the world and why this is a problem. You guys want to hear this last example, or is it getting, it's good? One more example? Okay. So this is the front page of the Wall Street Journal, one of our other big newspapers, back in 2005. It says, out of time as prisoners age, the terminally ill, or the dying, raise tough questions. So death rates in prisons are expected to increase exponentially as the population ages. We reached a really high apex in terms of prison deaths during the AIDS epidemic, which has steadily decreased over the years since effective therapies came about, and this is beginning to increase with population aging. So the death rate for prisoners aged 55 or older in the U.S. this is just how you report death rates, 2,123 per 100,000 person years. Doesn't matter so much except to say that that number is 4 times higher than it is for the next decade younger of people, which is how it should be. I mean, hopefully older people are dying more than younger people. It would be awful. I don't have it compared to Switzerland. We have death rates, so this is 100,000 person years. So I guess 213. So actually I think it was, the comparison was, if it were 21 here, then Switzerland was like 16. So it wasn't that much lower. But remember I told you, those numbers I didn't really trust them. They were from a UN report, but I'll show it to you. I didn't put it in because it said France was 42, and that was so much higher, it didn't seem right, so I'm not sure. And older prisoners account for most of these deaths. So in 2007, 1,500 state prisoners aged 55 or older died in the prison system. 1,500 people are dying. That's more people, that's like 5 times more people than you've got incarcerated. That is about half of all the deaths in the prison system. And in those short years, actually, the numbers just came out for 2011, and this went up to 65% of the deaths in the U.S. prison system were age 55 or older in 2011. So compassionate release. Have any of you guys heard of this term? So this is early release for people who are eligible, who have serious illness, where basically they're allowed to go outside of prison to die. And there are 2 elements, and many, many countries have this. I mean, I think the most famous international case was the Lockerbie bomber in the United Kingdom a couple years ago. Do you remember this case a little bit, Stefan? That you do? Anyway, so he was, the Lockerbie bomber was in a Scottish prison. He was let out because he had 2 physicians say that he had a diagnosis of, that he was dying of prostate cancer, and basically 2 years later he was still alive. So it created this whole international sort of scandal. Of course, the United States was so upset because we love to incarcerate everybody until they die and beyond if we could. So it's comprised of 2 elements that are very distinct. One is medical eligibility. That's what I'm going to talk about, and that's determined by physicians, at least in the United States and the United Kingdom. It's based on medical evidence, which is basically 6 months or less to live. And then approval. So once the physician says, yes, this person has 6 months or less to live, then the prison authorities and sometimes the courts, depending on the state or on the country, get involved to decide whether or not the person is safe to be released. So can you guys think of any problems with this number 1, with the prognosis of less than 6 months? Yep. So one question is, where will they go after they get released? Is it going to be good enough care, especially if they're poor and, you know, maybe they're going to be homeless? So that's absolutely true. Any other problems? How good are physicians at prognosis? Are we like super good? Like, can I look at you and say, this is the day that you're going to die? So we're excellent if it's hours, and we're pretty good if it's days. And we can also tell you that you're probably going to live more than 20 years, right? Like, I could probably tell a 3-year-old, unless something very, very strange happens, you have a 99% chance of making it to 23. And I can sit by somebody's bedside who's actively dying and say to their family, we're looking at a few hours or a few days. But when we talk about months, physicians are almost as bad as rolling the dice. So you could basically walk up to the prisoner and roll the dice and look down at the number and say, 50-50 chance that I'm right. So this is not the smartest way to decide an entire medical policy. That said, we don't want 1,500 people dying in prison every year, right? At least I don't. So this is available, at least across the United States, in almost every state except for 2, but it's very infrequently used. So we did what's called a Freedom of Information Act request to the federal government. It took us 1.5 years, but we got these numbers, which was that in 2008, which was the numbers they gave us, there were 399 deaths in the federal prisons. So anyway, it's a subset of the prisons in the United States. 27 people requested it. So sometimes people don't request it because they have nowhere else to go. So this is really a patient-initiated. So it's not a big issue in the United States, although it's certainly theoretically a major issue. 6 applicants died during the final review process, and most of the other people, they still hadn't decided. So our question was, are there medical-based reasons for this potential underuse? And we did a big study, and we basically found two overarching themes. First of all, that medical eligibility guidelines completely do not reflect the way that people die. So most guidelines, again, I said, are 6-month prognosis, sometimes even a year prognosis, even harder for physicians to say. But this excludes things like severe dementia, like being in a coma. There were 6 prisoners in California in comas for 10 years that didn't know who they were, couldn't say their names, didn't recognize anything, but didn't have less than 6 months to live, so they stayed there. End-stage organ damage, things like severe heart failure. Many of these people live for months to years. They're totally incapable of posing harm to society, of participating in rehabilitation, or in terms of dementia, they don't actually even know that they're in prison and being punished. And so the example we gave was a 20-year-old man who is in a coma, who's going to live more than 6 months, and so he's not eligible at all for release. And secondly, barriers often prevent medically eligible people from obtaining compassionate release. So a lot of the guidelines require a written petition, but most people who are dying have actually cognitive impairment. They're not able to go through the entire process of really writing this whole request down with all these legal terms. Prisoners have the nation's lowest literacy rates. I'm sure that's the case here as well. Imagine asking that 77% are undocumented, you said, immigrants. So imagine asking them to write a whole legal petition in Swiss. They're totally not able to. In the United States, they definitely can't write it in, well, in French, I guess. I guess there's no Swiss, but you know what I mean. French or German, whatever. We can't do it in American either, or English. They're totally distanced from family and friends, and they often have no one to advocate for them. And it's an extraordinarily lengthy process, so a lot of people actually die while they're waiting for their case to be heard. And the examples we gave were a 7-year-old man with dementia who had no family, no friends. He wasn't able to advocate himself. He didn't even know, when the physician said to him, you know, there's this process that you can use, he just didn't even understand. And it had to be from him. And a 30-year-old man with metastatic lung cancer who basically is really fit. And he was going to be fine until the last couple weeks of his life, at which time it was going to be too late for him to get through the compassionate release process. So he wasn't going to be debilitated enough until the very end. So we made recommendations based on this palliative care and geriatrics model. First, that we have to establish uniform medical eligibility criteria that reflect the way that people experience serious illness. That there should be different ways to be assessed for if you have something like a solid tumor like colon cancer, which is actually pretty easy to say how long somebody has, versus dementia, which is very difficult to say how long somebody has, versus something like coma or end-stage heart failure, where people really go up and down. And there are different ways to prognosticate for each of those, but the guidelines should reflect those different ways that people die. Secondly, that we need to overcome these procedural barriers by giving everybody who's seriously ill an advocate and creating a fast-track option for people who are dying quickly. And third, and I think that this is most important, that any time that somebody is considered for early release, that we should have a very robust hospice and palliative care program, which is basically improves quality of life and lowers costs while people are in this process. So I'm going to list for you very quickly some next steps so we can get to question and answer if you have any questions. But basically, our team is now moving to a transdisciplinary approach. We've been working with former inmates, with sociologists, with police, judges, attorneys, to really start to think about this process from many different angles. The 4 sort of biggest things that we're working on right now are, first of all, to look at policies that are not about health, but that have unanticipated health consequences. And I'm going to give you one very quick example of each of these, to address the educational needs of people who are not physicians and doctors, and physicians and nurses, to think about the data that we don't have, and to start making a real policy agenda around this. And so when we think about health consequences, it's things like third strikes, where if physicians and nurses and other healthcare clinicians are not at the table when these sentencing decisions get made, then we end up with something like third strikes. And 20 years later, we're saying, oh my God, look at all these 85-year-olds. Things like solitary confinement, where solitary confinement, when people are in a room alone for many, many years, and they're not able to leave the cell, except for maybe 1 hour 3 times a week. And this happens a lot in the United States, much, much, much less here. this may be this is a major human rights violation in my opinion, but it's a special human rights violation for older adults who really need to be able to exercise and move to stay healthy. The 3 strikes, I'm sorry. So the 3 strikes Dr. Wolf was talking about in his talk. So 3 strikes is this crazy policy where, I mean, only in the United States would we create an entire criminal justice policy based on a baseball game. But basically it's from 3 strikes and you're out. So you can have 3 minor but federal offenses and you go for life. In Arizona alone, it was about 400. So they get to go outside of their cell 1 hour, 3 times a week, to a cell that no one else is in, but it's outside. So our national ACLU, which is the American Civil Liberties Union, which is one of our biggest human rights national law firms and policymakers, this is their issue right now. And they're bringing many lawsuits trying to challenge this and bringing in all sorts of different points of view. And one of the things my team is working on is basically looking at how solitary confinement affects older adults for them. So lots of different ways that this works. We're also addressing the educational needs of non-health professionals. So my team has trained 350 police officers in San Francisco to recognize dementia and at least to consider that an older person didn't hear them when they were asked to stop. And police officers have these just these wonderful questions for us. I mean, what do I do when I'm dealing with a longtime gun owner? The guy owns a gun, and I go to his house for something else, and I see he's got the gun, and he seems like maybe he has dementia. Am I supposed to do something? And the answer is yes, but they haven't been told to do anything, so they don't know what to do. So we're working on systems of care with them, with the Department of Aging Services in San Francisco, to address those kind of questions. They said, a big question they have is he suffering from an age-related health condition, or is he actually being criminal? Is he doing something bad, or is it just his memory that's making him? So we also have talked with legal professionals, and one of the defenders, so somebody who represented the person when they went to court, he said his crime was to go to Starbucks, the coffee shop, and steal the tip jar, where you basically give them money for that, yeah. He would always go back no matter what, even with a stay-away order, like a judge said you cannot go to that Starbucks, and he would go back, even though we would tell him every day not to go. He would go back to the same Starbucks and steal the same tip jar. And I think if we had been more educated, basically about dementia and what was going on with him, we could have done a better job, and maybe he wouldn't have gone back, but he's still floating around the system, in and out and in and out. So working with public defenders and judges and district attorneys to reconceptualize, to rethink what the strategy is for somebody like that instead of just sending them to jail. Again, this is unfathomable to you guys, but this is how we get our very, very high incarceration rates in the United States. We've been talking a lot about addressing missing data, so we have a profound lack of health data in the criminal justice system. This is actually a problem worldwide, except for in Australia, I would say. And it really affects and limits our ability to deal with this crisis internationally. So my team looked at the 36 most commonly used national health data sets, and we found that 72% completely did not allow prisoners in the study design. 8% of study had a question about incarceration, and that was it. And some of them were just, have you ever been incarcerated? Of course, if you ask a 75-year-old if they've ever been incarcerated, maybe they were in jail for 2 hours. It's probably different than if somebody was in for 50 years. So still, we don't really have the right answers. And an even more profound lack of cost data. I mean, just in this talk alone, you heard 2 different estimations of cost. And the people who wrote those estimations of cost, the one that Dr. Wolf used and the one that I used, are probably totally certain that they're right. And the reason why they're totally different is because we really have no public accounting of criminal justice costs, and certainly not of healthcare costs. And so really the biggest drivers of why this population is so expensive, which everybody agrees on, we pretty much don't know. So we don't even know where to target our efforts. And then finally, we've been talking about creating a policy agenda, and we published this recently, basically with sort of the top issues when we brought together attorneys and judges and human rights people and physicians and nurses and everybody, prison officials. We brought everybody together, and these were sort of the top issues that we came up with to address the aging crisis, and we're trying to start from here. These include defining who is an older prisoner exactly, so everybody's starting with the same age. Training staff in geriatric care, just basic geriatric care, and this is something my group is piloting in the local jail in San Francisco. To define functional impairment, that case that I talked about in the beginning. To screen prisoners for dementia. We don't recommend screening people in society in general for dementia because there's not a lot you can do about it, but in prison, we recommend screening annually because it has such big implications. To think about long-term care, things like nursing facility level care, and what are we going to do? Until we change our policies, we basically have to prepare for this population. To think about what the problems are for them as they reintegrate into society, especially around healthcare. To think about creating more of a national eligibility criteria, maybe even for issues that are not just related to dying, but also for severe disability in older adults. And to think about creating better systems of hospice care and care for people with very serious illness in the prison setting. And there are programs sort of around the world that are cropping up sort of as an example of why this problem, of how this problem is such a big problem really around the globe. I'm not going to go into all the details of these, but in the UK and Canada, even in Uruguay, where they recommend house arrest for everybody over the age of 70, except for very, very few people who've participated in a violent crime where the state really just cannot figure out any other way to punish them. And so in summary, the worldwide population is aging. It's aging dramatically. It's affecting every part of society, including the criminal justice system. Many criminal justice populations around the world are aging. The population shift has created a major health and economic or fiscal crisis, at least in the U.S. I believe, my team believes, and hopefully I've shown you that the application of widely tested geriatrics models and palliative care models can basically tell us the points of entry, just to start, like the low-hanging fruit, the things to just start with, to start making a difference. And really the next step is a transdisciplinary approach to analyzing policy, to doing research, to doing educational interventions, finding the right data and reporting it, and creating health interventions to solve this problem. So this says, good news, honey, 70 is the new 50. Basically, we're all going to live a lot longer, so you'll be young for a long time. And this is my email if you have any questions at all.